Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for being with us. I will be, originally I was not scheduled to be the moderator of this panel, but my colleague, Camila Moreno is with technical difficulties because of the connection, so I will substitute her, and that's why we delayed it a little bit. In this first panel, entitled Living the Vertical City, Urban Types and Social Spatial Changes, we will have 4 presentations. We will begin with the work of Louise Dorignon that will be presented by my colleague from Lyon, Manuel Appert, View as a Spatial Capital in the Volumetric City. Then we'll go on with Asma Resk-Kallah with the panel or the talk, The Contemporary Verticalization of the City of Oran, Algeria, and its Landscape Effects. And then we have 2 other presentations, Milena Sartori and Maíra Daitx, with talk about recent transformations on urban structures, access areas, the case of São Paulo. And then our colleague from UFBA, from Salvador, Bahia, Julio Pedrassoli, with remote sensing, high-rise urban morphology, and land value. Right? So, going strictly further, I'm then asking, please, Manuel, if you can start, feel free whenever you want. Okay? Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. The usual question, can you hear me? Okay, it's the question that we have asked the most in the last year on the internet. Can you hear me? So as you see, I am not Louise Dorignon. I am Manuel Appert. I used to be Louise Dorignon, a PhD supervisor with Christian Montes. But Louise is currently doing a postdoctoral fellowship in Melbourne, in Australia. And at this time of the day, she cannot afford to present. She's sleeping. So I'm presenting for her. Part of the presentation will deal with, to contextualize a PhD thesis, and then I will present the first thinking on a new paper we are writing at the moment on views as spatial capital in the volumetric city. So currently, Louise is based at RMIT in Melbourne. And she's doing a postdoctoral on housing outcomes, metrics, and evaluation. And now she's also working on the question of COVID and home. And she's most interested in the impact of design regulations on lived experiences. She was involved, and she's still involved in the Highrise project, through a doctoral project that was completed in 2019 at the University of Lyon 2, in partnership with the University of Melbourne. So for the first part, I will present you the work of Louise, a PhD, and then focused on the second part on the paper we are writing. And so this is a work under construction, a work in progress. So I hope it will trigger some discussions among us. First of all, the PhD of Louise drove from a global phenomenon of the vertical expansion of cities drawing back especially on the Skyline project that Manuel and Christian have already mentioned this morning, and continuing into the Highrise project. And she has developed a research on the role played by a high-rise residential building in daily life of people in the city of Melbourne. Especially on different experiences and with different kind of approaches. First of all, as a relational geography, like the work of Baxter, and also a more emotional geography, like the work of Kerr, Gibson, and Clocker. In the context of Australia, in the University of Melbourne, where she did a PhD, she was supervised by a colleague that worked on the question of high-rise living, and also several PhD students like Costello that worked on the new way of life in new buildings in Melbourne. So she was drawing from this work, and she was researching after their work. The question of high-rise living and the experiences of high-rise living is something that is not very much developed in the Anglo-Saxon world, but also in the French world as well. And so this is a particularly urgent agenda for researchers, and that's why she developed this research. So why working on vertical living in Melbourne? Because first of all, Melbourne was has been verticalizing a lot since the beginning of the year 2000. The population has rapidly grown, and also because of migration and local population growth, the need for housing was very important. In this context, the municipality has developed a plan, the 2021 Big Housing Built policy, that enabled all kind of policies that enhance the volume of housing construction, and considering that a lot of investors from the world, from the Asian world, but also from Europe and the Americas, wanted to invest, so Melbourne started to verticalize, and verticalization was one of the political answer to the sustained growth of the population. Not the only one, but one of the main driver for housing development in the city of Melbourne. This is also the expression of the financialization logics of commercial real estate market in Melbourne, but also elsewhere in the world. And this is one of the focus of the Highrise project. In the context of Melbourne, apartment living has been quite rare, and not a lot of people are living in high-rise building, if you accept some high-rise project or public housing built in the 1960s and 70s, but they are not as numerous as in Europe. So historically, living in high-rise is not necessarily something that is very Melbourneian, and above all, it's not very much the experience of people living in the suburbs of Melbourne. Because one of the interests of the work of, one of the major points of the work of Louise is that she worked on the suburb, one suburb in particular of Melbourne, because these suburbs were also experiences high-rise constructions. The aim and the framework of the work of Louise is based on the microscale analysis of social relations within and around two apartment developments in the inner suburbs or suburb of Yarra in Melbourne. And the attention that Louise is having in this particular work is to reveal the processes through which new middle-class high-rise buildings are produced and live in. So the work of Louise is looking at the suburbs, the high-rise in the suburbs, the people that living in these high-rise in the suburbs, but she's also relating this to the question of class, And the way people that are choosing to live in these places tend to negotiate their social class in society, in the suburban society of Melbourne. She's particularly focused on the middle classes because these are a very expensive quite of apartments. So in the middle classes living these developments, and she's looking at how they negotiate housing tenure and governance, and how they achieve the social status through the housing. She specifically used a theoretical framework from Michel de Certeau, using tactics and strategies to try to frame how these dealers, were negotiating the urban form in the building, such as the lift, such as the lobby, such as the private gardens, but also their domestic space, inside space, and how they show to the world how they live, etc., etc. So she framed all that around the question of tactics and strategies. To develop research, she made several field work, and in two high-rise buildings. You see, this is not a very spectacular high-rise building. This is not the kind of building you see in London or you can see in Sao Paulo, but this is very high and very with a very big footprint for the suburban Melbourne. The two buildings consist of 12 and 17 floors. They were built after 2010, and they cover about 300 apartments. They are upmarket developments with an affluent clientele, and they have a lot of common space, amenities such as pools, such as gyms, etc., etc. Louise did some interviews, around 40 interviews with apartment dealers, but also with professional stakeholders. There were semi-direct interviews with participants at home or around walking tours around the building or inside the buildings. The main findings, so you can have a look at the thesis of Louise, which is available at the link, at the web link that you have here on the screen. What she found out is that competing actors all work toward the co-production of high-rise living spaces and culture. So high-rise living is not something given. This is something constructed, and this construction is based on the relationality of the built form, the building, the design, and the kind of people that live in these places. So the middle classes and the status of these middle classes. So this is the most important aspect of thesis, is how design and the built form is completely entangled with the experience of people and the status of these people. However, housing relations in the practice of middle-class apartment living outline an uneven and changing distribution of power between those who develop strategies and those who craft tactics. So while people are living in these places, through time, you have the status is negotiated around the tactics and the strategies of the people, and a new hierarchy can appear of people living on the top floors, on the floor below, etc., etc. More broadly, this research opens up a deeper understanding of how this new kind of vertical city reflects and transforms configurations of status, power, and identity in the Australian suburb. So while I was contextualizing the work of Louise, now I'm going through the second part of the presentation, which is the work under construction, or the work which is currently in thinking with Louise, with view as a spatial capital in the volumetric city. So what the starting point of all of this was to say that the question of the view, the landscape, or the relationality of the domestic space and the outside space, the use of the balconies, the terraces, but also the relation to the horizon, so the city of Melbourne, and also the immediate vicinity of the buildings with all the streets level, etc., etc. This is something that has not been thoroughly investigated, and it is something that we want to further gain insight. So the starting point is the work is still based on the two buildings that Louise has already interviewed and already experienced in the suburb of Yarra. We are still working on the middle class people and questioning their identities and class, notably in relation to their apartment living and to the building. We are building this work also on the question of living, the ability to live and the desire to remain a middle class. And then we want to mobilize a theoretical framework which has been proposed by Jacques Lévy in 2009 with the notion of spatial capital, which already drove from Bourdieu, Le Capital Social, which is a cultural dimension of class. And the idea of spatial capital is to say that resources accumulated by actors allow them to take advantage of society, spatial distribution or spatial dimension. So Jacques Lévy has added a new dimension to the notion of capital social with the spatialities of the experience of people. So the question is, how does high-rise living produce spatial configurations of class? For instance, taste and the display of belongings seen as luxurious in the apartment. Here are the first topics we want to explore. There are three topics. The first one is the views and the relation to intimacy, gardening practices in the suburban context. First of all, from the first quotation that Louise proposed us here is, she's quoting an owner of a flat in Acacia Place. It doesn't appeal to me at all to have a garden. I can't imagine having everyone watching me when I'm in my garden. So gardening is considered as an intimate part of the home, but not on a terrace balcony, because it inevitably involves the gaze of neighbors. So this is the first topic we want to explore. The second one is dealing with the view as a production of suburban nature. Suburban feeling of home through plants and view on suburban nature is one of the features of these apartment living. Plants everywhere, that became a thing to populate the place with plants as well. It was pretty sterile before, and I haven't put anything up on the walls yet. The plants are, I guess, the feature of the room. This is a quotation from an owner of the Yorkshire Brewery, one of the two buildings studied, which means that the relationship with the suburban nature, so the landscape composition, which is organized by landscapists, but also the natural compositions with all the parks and greeneries are part of the living experience. And from the point of view of this jeweler, it can be also part of the experience of the inside of the building, considering that these buildings are pretty expensive and the size of the apartments are quite small. The third topic is the strategic spatialization of the view. Design and marketing strategy balance out small size apartments and also the need for smaller windows because of the minimal heat transfer that provide these small windows. So the question of the strategic composition of the view and the organization of what is viewed from the window is very important, because the apartments are small and because also the windows are getting smaller because of environmental regulations. So this is two quotations, one from a real estate developer, reshrunk the windows in the bedrooms because generally you're not in there. You're there for sleeping or you're waking up. From also a renter in Acacia Place, you're not getting to see that expensive view outside. I just moved my furniture around. So there are strategies around inside also the domestic space to maximize the view. And the fourth topic, the uneven social values of urban views. Comprehension or appropriation of the surrounding suburbs, while dissociation through the elevation of the dwelling, with undesirable elements being perceived in the urban domesticity and more positive value ascribed to being seen from afar. So the values of the view can be different, very different from the point of view of jurors, but also in terms of the things that we see in the immediate vicinity of the view, but also long distance views. And finally, this is the discussion we want to highlight in association with the Highrise project. Is discussing the question of the view as a social construction and performance in the context of consumption cultures, and also well-defined aesthetics that we can find in a more global sense in Sao Paulo, in London, in Lyon, or elsewhere. There's sort of globalization of the consumption cultures of the view and the negotiation of the view. The question of the view is also a way to better comprehend the belonging to the surrounding suburbs, but also to interpret the distanciation with the view to a dissociation device that can be closed off. We can have a total intimacy and be closed off to the neighbors, but we can also open up to the cities. This is something that is highly negotiated and easily negotiated by the jurors. And also the view can also participate in the interrogation of the high-rise as an enclaves, because the view can prevent people from going out or from experiencing other parts of the city, because they have, through the view and through the surrounding and the landscaping, a lot of attributes that are considered that local or also global, but they can attach a value to. And I think I'm done. I'm sorry for the very chaotic way of presenting it, because this is not exactly my work. So I try to do my best to be the clearest as possible, but it is not my initial text. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. It was extremely clear and objective, and I thank you for all the effort to resume and presenting somebody else's work. Thanks a lot. Now we'll move to Asma. Okay. Whenever you want.
Yes, I will share.
Get me rid of the screen. Get rid of me on the screen.
Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we see.
It's okay?
Yes, we see the full screen. I think you can
Okay.
start whenever you want.
I can. Okay, thank you. So hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you today. I present myself, Asma Resk-Kallah Asma, PhD student at the University of Mostaganem in Algeria. This contribution is a part of thesis work focuses on the landscape impact of towers in Oran City, paying attention to the landscape perception of the inhabitants. These perceptions are studied through two scales of the landscape, the city and the neighborhood. But for today, the presentation will discuss the context of verticalization in Oran. It questions the impact of tower on the landscape and the private spaces of the residents. And in order to illustrate the urban transformations and the experience among residents of the city, we will discuss the example of a neighborhood that is facing a strong real estate pressure. My work concerns the city of Oran, is a coastal city located in northwestern Algeria, second city of the country. It knows from the 2000s an acceleration of the verticalization of its landscape. The eruption of towers come in a context marked by a financial boom due to the hydrocarbon revenues, the liberalization of real estate markets, and the arrival in the construction market of
No. Asma, you listen to us? Asma, we lost your connection, I believe. Let me see. Maybe Evandro, can you send her a message and maybe we can shift the presentations. We can move to Maíra and Milena and then we come back, hoping that she will have a better connection. Evandro, can you send her a message, or even you or Christian? Christian, can you send her a message, maybe by WhatsApp? Just to is that possible?
Well, I will try to send her a message.
Okay,
but
let's do it. And then
WhatsApp, it's not possible. Yeah.
Okay. And Evandro, please also send her. I'll send a message here in the chat and also by email. But let's move, and then we'll have Maíra Daitx and Milena Sartori presentation. Okay. Thank you, Maíra and Milena, for being here today.
Are you listening to me? Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank you to be part of this research project. Milena and I, we are very happy to be here, to be able to share to you our work inside the Highrise project and have this opportunity to be part of an international research group like it was for the last 4 years.
Good afternoon,
Milena?
everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share this virtual space with you.
Okay. Milena, if you want to say anything, just make an appointment that I will pass my voice to you, okay?
Okay.
Well, we'll briefly explain to you our part on the Highrise project. Milena and I, we're in the graduate course of our Institute of Architecture and Urbanism from the University of São Paulo. And we both investigate new temporary forms of production of public spaces with the cutouts of the city of São Paulo. We were trying to understand if these new public spaces, these new temporary public spaces, they had a relationship between the new production of high rises in central areas of São Paulo, because we saw that there was a concentration of both public and private spaces production, especially the production of high rises, vertical buildings. After we decided that we were going to investigate the Pinheiros area, we saw that there was also a relationship between those production and the alterations on the urban laws, especially the zoning law and the general urban plan that we had in 2014 and 2016. Unfortunately, especially the French people, they weren't able to be here with us because of the pandemic. So I'm going to show you briefly a kind of a state of the art of our area, so you can understand a little bit about the landscape. Pinheiros neighborhood is a very elitized area from São Paulo. It's a very expensive area that had been through an important transformation with new mixed-use high-rises in the last 5 years, but also an increase of elitized commerce areas in one of their main streets, which is Pinheiros Street. So there are a lot of bars and restaurants there that are attracting a lot of consumers, not only from the neighborhood, but from the whole city, and a lot of media too. Milena investigates what we call the parklet. A parklet is a temporary public space that it can be privately supported, financially supported, or supported by the public, by the city hall. They are concentrated normally in the central areas of São Paulo. This is the perimeter. The central areas are around here. Here are also the areas that are more developed in the city. And I investigated temporary urban events that happen on public spaces, which were attracted by the presence of food trucks. We had already a data gathering about those both information, and we crossed those information with the new high-rises releases in the city. By that point, we thought that we should investigate since 2010, because the number of food trucks events and parklets started around 2012, 2014. But then we decided to investigate only high-rises from 2016, so on, because that's the date that the zoning law altered. So we'll have bigger transformations after 2016. Initially, we had a bigger area of study. This is the neighborhood of Pinheiros. We have here the Tietê River and the Pinheiros River here. So it's a central area with a lot of infrastructures, and the area is just along with a bus corridor. So the area became a really important piece in São Paulo's territory for the expansion of the structural axis. The structural axis was a new proposal from the general plan from 2014, where the areas surrounding bus corridors, metro stations, and train stations were supposed to be more densified than inner neighborhood areas. So as you can see here in, I would say, light light blue or purple. And in yellow are the axes that are supposed to receive more high-rise buildings than the inner neighborhood areas, okay? And our area is one of that. Our area has 2 metro stations. It's already a fully consolidated, I would say, area. We have a lot of vertical buildings on the east side that were built during the 70s mostly. Some spread high-rise buildings here on the west side that were built in different periods of the verticalization process of the city, so since the 50s. We have 5 bicycle lines in red and 3 main streets that are related to the production of our high-rise buildings recently, which is Rebouças Avenue that had passed by a really important landscape transformation in the last years, Faria Lima Avenue that will lead to a financial center concentration here, so a lot of business going on there, and the people who are going to live in these areas are normally work related to the area of Faria Lima. Pinheiros Street, which is the area that concentrates the new restaurants and bars from the neighborhood. And this is small, low-density area that is now protected by law, so it's under heritage regulation. So this area that were before on the access limits, they won't be verticalized anymore. To show to you a little about the topology patterns that we have in our area, we'll see normally 2 to 3 story houses, multifamiliar or unifamiliar houses. Here in this photo, you can see that this is the area that is protected by heritage. There are 3-story, the little buildings from Pinheiros. The 3-story commercial areas, mixed use, where the ground floors are used for popular commerce, they're away from the street, the Rebouças Avenue. They are more concentrated on this area. So they are more popular, and also the part of the area that is cheaper to live. We have the area that has been through a gentrification process. There were a lot of residential units that were transformed into commercial units. So they occupy both of the stores of the buildings, and they have a lot of alternative commerce and also bars and restaurants. And the old mansions that were concentrated in Rebouças Avenue, in this area of the city, that were transformed majorly into offices and clinics. Along with that, we had a lot of high-rise typologies, old ones. This one is from the 50 periods, where you have mixed use. They normally don't have leisure areas, so they are simple apartments with no facilities as swimming pools, academies, that you can see, gyms, sorry, that we can see in the other recent buildings. The majority of the area has this kind of typology that is fenced or circulated by walls. They are high-income typology, so you have 1 or 2 apartments per story. And, well, they are also concentrated on the east side. That is more residential. This is the typology of the 2000s, where they are really similar to the one from the 70s, but you normally have a distance from the sidewalk into the entrance of the building. You can create more privacy to the residents too, but also it's privately controlled, so this is not a public space, okay? And this is the most recent typology. As you can see here, you have normally the first floors that are occupied by offices, clinics, and stores. Part of them is active facade, and the apartments are on the top of this basement of the whole building. They are all mixed uses, most of them. We only have one that is not, and they all have the same look. So in Pinheiros, you can see normally all kinds of typology in the same block. So you have new buildings, older buildings, medium buildings, and low rises from different type of uses in the same block, in the same street. Sorry, I see part of our presentation not showing here. Now I'm going to explain you a little bit what is the differences that this new general plan brought to us and the alterations of the zoning law in 2016, because that in a way directed a lot the market in our area, especially in these areas that I told you there was along the Rebosas Avenue. Well, our general plan will focus on trying to create sustainable urban development. For that, they decided to disincentive also mobile ways of transportation and incentive the public transportation. So in the new buildings of the area, they say that we have a maximum of parking lots of 1 per housing unit. Before that, it was mandatory to have 1 parking lot per housing unit. Now you can have housing units without any parking lot. They have a minimum sidewalk, so you can increase the quality of the mobility of pedestrians. And they have incentives for donation of part of the land lots to public fruition. So it could be on the border of the buildings along the sidewalk, or it could be in the internal areas of the plot. Besides that, they incentivize active facades and mixed use so that the pedestrian can have an interaction between the public space and the private space, and also increase the urbanity of the area. And also, this is not regarding means of transportation, but it's related to, is to increase the density of areas that are surrounding the transportation lines and the public transportation stations like metro and trains. So in these areas, the contractors can build more. They have an increase on their floor space ratio in comparison with other areas from the city. The limit now is 4, so you can build 4 times the space you have, the land you have. But this was already really common in inner neighborhood areas in the previous plan. So you don't have actually an alteration on the maximum floor space ratio from the city, but you have areas that weren't allowed to build a lot, and now they are. So with the creation of the new zoning law, we see that the verticalization that happened on the inner part of the neighborhood now is being directed to the areas that are close to the public transportation infrastructure. In our area specifically, we had already a really densified zone on this pink area, but now the new developments have to be transferred to the areas that are close to the transportation lines. What end up is that the results is that the new high rises are concentrated on these green zones. These green zones had a maximum FSR that were very low at the beginning. So in 2014 up to 2014. So they were the ones that had the highest increase on the constructive potential of the area. So these are normally the areas that we will see the majority of the new high-rises in the whole city of São Paulo, because they were neglected by the previous plan that considered these blocks with a bad quality of life. They had a lot of noise and pollution, air pollution, and now they are becoming really attractive for the market. Another important increment for the new general urban plan is that they created a minimum number of housing units per land lot. So if you have a land lot that has 1,000 square meters, you have a max land lot quota of 20, which means that you will have a minimum number of housing units that is 50, and that increases the density of the area. So in comparison to what was before, you can have more units per the same area of terrain, of land. We made an evaluation about how this landlord quota was present in our area, even before the implementation of the law. And we saw that in these areas that are on the east side, which is the area that has the unifamiliar and exclusively residential high-rises, the landlord quota is really high. So you have a lot of apartments that are really big, and there are only 1 or 2 per floor. Their areas are bigger than the ones that we see on the other part of the area or for a zone. So this is not the ideal neighborhood that the new general plan wanted. They created incentives so that the new contractor, the contractors could create new high-rises with more units. And the new buildings, they correspond to that demand. So as you can see here, the average of the land quota per period had decreased a lot on the last period of the last zoning law. And also the number of housing units that were released on this recent period is almost equal to the ones that were released during 30 years of this period. If you have any doubts about that, you can post it on the video because it's a little complicated to explain. Another goal from the general urban plan was to create socioeconomic mix and include social housing and popular market housing in the central areas of the city, which included the access areas. One means to that was also the landlord quota, where once you have a minimal number of units, you would create smaller units, and that would also be cheaper units, so people could afford it more easily. We know that this didn't happen, at least not in the area of Pinheiros, because even though you have smaller units, this is the minimal area of the high-rises building. So you have here apartments with 25 square meters and apartments with 230 square meters. So you have a micro housing in the area, but we'll also have a lot of big housing areas, apartments in the area. But the price of them are still not under the limit that is that the public bank can fund. So we would call that popular market housing. So even though you create really small units, that doesn't mean that we will have a socioeconomic mix on the area, because these small units, they are actually being sold for high income classes, or they're being sold to investors, private investors. And this is one of the examples that I want to show to you, is that our area has private buildings that only a company owns, so they are not sold to the population. The company manages all the apartments for high income rent, and well, the results of this is that we don't have a social mix on the area, but we also have the implementation of different lifestyles on the area, because the people who are going to live in these buildings, they are normally people that have higher mobility from one city to the other. And that confronts part of the lifestyle that is already present on the area. So the new high-rises is starting to have side plans or structures of creating barriers where the people that are going to live on the studios doesn't mix. They won't meet the permanent dwellers of the area in the same corridors. They have different access to the buildings. They have different entrances. They have different leisure facilities. So you're not going to share the same gym or the same swimming pool with the people that live on the biggest apartments. They have their own leisure area. Another important point of the new general urban plan was to incentive mixed uses on the access areas. As we can see here in pink, all of the new high-rises, or almost all of the new high-rises, were mixed use. So they have housing units, but they also have areas for stores on the ground floor, and some of them had offices or spaces for meetings and clinics to rent on the first floors. So this was an actually really interesting upgrade from this new general urban plan. But what we could saw when we were visiting the areas is that part of this mixed use is exclusive for the dwellers of the buildings. So you can go to, for example, a restaurant on the ground floor if you're a normal person, but the people who lives on the building can have access to the same meal on their own apartment. So they have this kind of differentiation. Another thing is that there are some buildings, new high-rises, that the ground floor was transformed into a mini mall. So it's a mini shopping mall that is privately controlled. You don't have a direct relationship with the sidewalk or the public space. And that kind of reproduces the exclusivity logic that we have in our cities.
Well, the qualification of public spaces at the building level takes place based on four main parameters: the donation of areas for fruition and the establishment of a minimum width for the sidewalks and the incentive to active facade and consequent restriction on wall closure. The donation of areas for fruition has a counterpart, a discount on the onerous grant. Although the donated area may be inside or on the sides of the lot, all 80 buildings that donated area in the case study did so in the alignment of the sidewalk, probably aiming to reach the minimum width established for the sidewalks of 5 meters, in which the front setback of the building is not necessary. Besides that, the vehicle access to the building does not need to be compartmentalized by uses, providing a continuous sidewalks. However, the new requirements are applied only to the new buildings, so that it will not necessarily result in a continuous improvement of the sidewalk and public space. Maíra, please. That is the example of the white 2880 building. Its implementation exemplifies how the concept of an active facade is interpreted in the legislation. Even with flower beds, vehicle circulation, and parking spaces in a 5-meter range between the alignment and the facade, it can be considered active as long as it has opening and visual permeability to the street and is physically integrated into the public sidewalk with unrestricted access without any type of closure. Although the general urban plan brings proposal for fruition to break with the logic of the traditional lot, we see that this logic persists. About the incentive to individual motorized transport, the regulation predicted the limit of 1 parking space per housing unit whose area would not be calculated as a built area. This incentive aimed to reduce the number of parking spaces per building, and even if the numbers indicate a drop, its results cannot yet be properly evaluated since this determination was not active between the years 2016 and 2019, being replaced by the limit of 1 parking space for each 60 square meter of area, a value that is currently requested in the review of General Urban Plan. However, what was we observing the buildings of the area was the reallocation of parking spaces destined to studios for larger apartments that maintain the standards of 2 or 3 spaces per apartment. Since the typology of studios was intended in most cases for people living alone or for temporary rent, it was considered that their demand could be supplied by public transport. In addition, one of Daitx's proposals is to encourage alternative forms of transport, which is why part of the public investment was destined to the construction of the cycle lane that connects Rebouças Avenue to the existing cycle path in the city and to the installation of bike racks in some of the subway stations, like Fradique Coutinho. Despite the intent, the new cycle lane has been widely criticized for having been built with low quality and amenity width on the sides of the avenue, offering risks to the cyclists. Besides that, the reduced space also does not allow the construction of stops or parking lots, which are under the responsibility of real estate developments. All of these parameters that define the construction of new buildings in the area of the axis show results that are reflected not only in the level of the building, but also have consequences for the public spaces, directly affecting the daily lives of the residents and visitors to the area. The first consequence and most directly connected to the construction parameters is the question of the view. With the possibility of building taller buildings and maintaining the low density parameters at jardins, as already expressed by Maíra, the buildings built on the boundary between the neighborhoods on Rebouças Avenue gain a permanent view of the city, which will not be obstructed by no other building. At the same time, these new buildings overlap with the old ones, which lost the views they had previously and are restricted from the horizon they had when they bought their properties. Beside the dispute for the view, the encouragement of mixed-use fruition and active facades caused a transformation at ground level. The increase in commercial activities and the enlargement of sidewalks and public spaces allow the development of new interfaces and activities that mediate the relationship between private establishment and the public space, one of the premises of the legislation on the urban structural axis. These occupations are regulated by a recent platform created by the City Hall to control the use of public space for commerce and service provision, called Tolegal. Some examples observing the areas whose commercial use was recently approved. Some examples observing the area are the parklets. Maíra, you can show them.
Here.
The parklets, whose commercial use was recently approved. Also, commercial sidewalks occupation, food trucks, and events sponsored by brands and private establishments. These elements in general characterize an advance and extension of private activities to public space, which in many cases generate conflicts of interests and dissatisfaction for the residents who feel deprived of some of their basic rights, such as free movement on sidewalks or the right to pieces, for example. Even so, the development of these activities in the area becomes an urban attraction strongly explored by the new ventures and commercial establishment, which highlights in their advertising pieces the vitality of the neighborhood and invests for this to happen, sponsoring the installation of parklets, events, and interventions in the area. Examples of these are the parklets installed by Tegra Incorporation, responsible for a development in the area, or the Caminhar Pinheiros project, sponsored by a city transport company and local merchants, and which proposed an intervention on the street that removed parking spaces to expand the public sidewalk with the installation of urban furniture, or also the occupation of Omaguazi Square for an itinerant market produced by artists and craftsmen, or the Pinheiros Festival, which closed the Pinheiros Street exclusively for pedestrians and promotes interactive and artistic activities twice a year.
This is another case from the area, a temporary food park that was installed for a period less than a year in one of the high-rises land lots before the beginning of the construction. So this is the only case that we saw temporary activities taking place on a construction site or before a construction site, because this is really common outside. I actually was in Lyon and other cities in Europe to investigate this type of practice. Here in Brazil, or especially in our area, this is the only site that received the temporary forms of appropriation in an area that will have a high-rise now.
It's important to highlight, however, that this more recent occupation of the public space coexists with other forms of occupation that remains revenues, legally or illegally. Although the regulation of the urban structural axis defines the need to implant popular markets with areas for street commercial and complementary uses in areas with a large circulation of people, there has been no initiative on this direction so far, so that informal and the irregular occupations of the sidewalk continues to coexist with the activities already regulated by the Legal program. And finally, to finish, Maíra. In addition to the more recent forms of privatization and the introduction of private practices in the public spaces, old structures and forms of privatization persist in the urban spaces. The incorporation of mechanisms that avoid the use of public furniture and private flower beds by homeless people, guard halls and gates that restrict access to certain streets exclusively to residents remain in the landscape as remnants of previous periods, although some of them are still used.
Well, our conclusions from this research is that the new temporary specialities, they're not necessarily related to the new production of high-rises, but they are appropriated by them as marketing strategies. Since they are identified as creative areas that have creative practice, and that becomes that turns Pinheiros into a really attractive neighborhood with an itinerary of an area that has a lot of urban activities, from art to restaurants, a lot of offer of bars and restaurants. They are all related to consumption. There is only one case in the area where you can see that there is a direct connection between a real estate company and the production of these public spaces, temporary public spaces, which was a parklet by Tegra. Tegra is a company that has other areas in the city of São Paulo that they interfere in the public spaces, but inside our area, this is the only case. We also can see that we have different lifestyles in the area, a kind of heterogeneity, especially on the commercial areas. But the new dwellers that are around in the area of the Pinheiros axis, they have the same social economic level than the previous ones. The only difference that sometimes they are more related to temporary flow, so people who are going to live in the city for just a few years, or they're going to stay there temporarily until they find a new and other apartment, sometimes in Pinheiros itself, sometimes somewhere else. And that the old dwellers from the area are still in conflict with these people because they are losing their privileges to the people who are going to live in these new buildings, especially their views. Regarding the new urban laws, we have some recommendations for the review of the new from the general urban plan this year. is that some points of the AXIS recommendations, they are not really being applied in our area, but we could say that in other AXIS areas from the city. Mixed uses and maximum floor space radio were all adopted by the new high rises. So I think that this was a proposition that actually succeeded. But fruition areas, so donation of part of the land to the public as public property, had been applied only to enlarge the sidewalk. So you don't have the break of the block and lot logic. So you don't have pedestrians crossing all the block. So new mobility access inside of these new real estate developments. The active facades also doesn't have any type of regulation, so you can have offices, clinics, and other type of non-residential uses on the ground floor that doesn't create any kind of relationship between the pedestrian and the private areas. And the most important ones, because we saw no example for that, is that we have no social housing or popular market housing inside our area. We know that part of them were constructed in other not central areas, periphery central areas, but we think that the revision of the general plan should have a deeper incentives, better incentives and mandatory shares, so that social housing and popular market housing were also installed in the central areas that are already really for the elite nowadays. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maíra and Milena. Asma, you are back, aren't you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. I hope that you will not face the same problem again.
I have also.
Okay, the connection was interrupted when you present your first photograph, the first image.
My first slide?
Yeah, not the first slide, the second one, I think. That was when the connection was interrupted. But feel free, if you want to restart again, feel free to restart. No problem, okay?
Okay, thank you. Okay. Yes, do you hear me?
Go ahead. We hear you. Go ahead. It's okay.
It's work or I don't? Do you hear me?
Yes, Asma, you can start. Okay.
So okay. So hello everyone. I'm gonna to present today my work, who is a part of focuses on the landscape impact of towers in Oran City, paying attention to the landscape perception of the inhabitants. For today, the presentation will discuss the context of verticalization in Oran, and it questions the impact of tower on the landscape and private spaces of the residents in order to illustrate the urban transformation and the experience among residents of the city. We will discuss the example of a neighborhood that is facing strong real estate pressure. So my work concerns the city of Oran, who is a coastal city located in northern Algeria, second city of the country. It knows from the 2000s an acceleration of the verticalization of its landscape. The urban of towers come in a context marked by financial boom due to the hydrocarbon revenues, the liberalization of real estate market, and the arrival in the construction market of foreign companies. In this study by high-rise building, we mean building having more than 12 floors. This complex is also marked by the eruption of tower comes also in a context marked by an improved standard of living and an aspiration to improve one's housing. In this context, a vast construction site of large urban complexes with a high density is being created on the outside of the city, composed by various programs of social and promotional housing produced by public actors. On the other side, the arrival of private real estate development has marked the urban landscape of Oran by the construction of residential towers. As we see, projects led by private actors located in a highly attractive area where the price of land per square meter is higher than the average. This verticality is organized in the form of clusters. We can see the concentration of towers, the central districts, the eastern districts, and the maritime fringe where we find the tallest tower. We also see a more punctual distribution around the major axes. This concentration of towers seems to be determined by certain factors. Firstly, according to the type of actors, as we see in the previous slide, but also the opportunity, the attractiveness of the territories and financial benefits, and the development of road access. In our study, we are particularly interested by the central districts dating from the 19th century, marked by the second ring. These districts are facing a strong verticalization real estate pressure, where private actions took precedence over public actions, and the districts now transformation due to speculative real estate market based on the land and financial opportunities. In our presentation, we will take the example of two neighborhoods, which is Gambetta and Galech. These two districts have similar morphological and social characteristics. The landscape of this neighborhood is characterized by the presence of various types of buildings, like dilapidated construction occupied by the lower income population, modest construction, and the high standing residence like tower or villa occupied by a well-off population. This variety of housing typologies, as we can see, is indicative of the diversity of populations in these districts. About the built environment is marked by the strong presence of individual houses with gardens, giving the landscape an open aspect and with the low density. These neighborhoods are under strong real estate pressure because of the living environment they can offer, their geographical location, who is attracting many buyers, their residential character, the views of the sea, and the proximity of many services. The other reason is the access of land, who has encouraged the verticalization of these neighborhoods. As we can see in the image, on the wall of some houses, we can read the inscription "for sale." which testifies to the extent of the renewal that the districts know. The reason given by people who sell their house and leave the neighborhood are the difficulty of maintaining their house, the obligation to sell the family property, and the nuisance or the problem caused by the towers. In this image, we can see the district of Bel Air. On the first photo, we have towers. We have one tower dating from the first phase of verticalization of the city, approximately from the end of the year 1950. We find this tower on the second image, even if she is not as visible with the contemporary towers. This is show that the densification in these neighborhoods is mainly done in favor of low-rise construction, hangars or villa with gardens, creating a drastic change of volumetric scale. Another example, the second district of Gambetta. We have here the Place Fontanelle and the second image after the construction of the towers. The process of urban renewal that is currently taking place in these districts comes from the juxtaposition and the accumulation of isolated high elements in an urban fabric that was not designed to accommodate projects this size. And also with the absence of spatial orientation and with the urban planning tools who don't provide a global approach to urban form and the urban landscape, towers are inserted according to the land and financial opportunities, without taking into account the social and morphological contexts of the neighborhood, which causes tensions and conflicts and problems in the landscape. The problem as imbalance in the landscape, increased land use, lack of sunlight, and high promiscuity. However, the alteration of certain landscape elements due to the eruption of the tower will not be experienced and perceived in the same way. It's why, in order to collect the different perceptions related to these towers, we conduct 5 interviews with residents who live next to the tower. Of these interviews, 3 of the house have a garden and 2 apartments have large terraces. For example, this image you can see on slide was taken from a garden of a resident I interviewed. From these interviews, it's appear that the tower's impact on the life of the residents at 2 moments during their construction, with the nuisance of the construction site, noise pollution, impact on their garden because of the pollution from the construction site, who has affected the vegetation in their garden. In the other side, we have the impact after their construction. High with the problem with the high promiscuity, lack of sunlight, the composition of the views, and the color of the landscape with the disappearance of the views to the sea and the mountains. Some points have been mentioned as positive changes, like impulse new dynamic, more varied shops, new service, and change the image of the district and the town. The impact of the tower is also manifested in the practice of private outdoor spaces, such as gardens, terraces, due to the strong promiscuity. The impact of the in this case, women seem to be the most affected in the practice of private spaces. They confide in feeling uncomfortable when they are in their gardens because of the high promiscuity. And for example, a woman having a panoramic view of the neighborhood from her terrace told me, "I used to leave the window open for my living room so I could see the sea from my sofa. Now I have to keep the curtain closed if I want to open the window. I don't like this proximity." The building, this picture was taken from her living room, and the building she's talking about, this white building, is 2 blocks away. But despite this, she no longer feels comfortable using the terrace because she has always had a clear view from there. Also, when she look out from her terrace, this woman describes the suffocation she feels when she sees the landscape of the district. Other residents I interviewed were thinking how they can reduce the promiscuity by using more vegetation, building a pergola, or building a higher wall. They also asked me an advice because they can no longer use their outdoor spaces. They told me that they don't feel like being in their private space because of the high promiscuity. It should be noted that the women are in the minority to using the public spaces in the neighborhood, which is why they attach so much importance to the private outdoor spaces. Another point raised in this interview is the relationship with the neighbors, which is very important to the residents. For the resident, the new tower would favor the anonymity of the inhabitants, and the people are worrying that they no longer know the persons who live on their streets. It's why people interviewed feel that the tower are not matching with the district conviviality and what they describe as the spirit of the neighborhood. But despite the problems, these residents do not want to leave the district. One of the reasons is the deep attachment they have to their home and the district and the lifestyle they appreciate. There is also the age of residents and the difficulty that a relocation can represent. I have to specify that most people I have spoken have more than 15 years old. 15. Another side, people who wish to stay in the neighborhood and improve their housing told me that they have no other choice but to leave the neighborhood because of the high prices. Others told me even if they sell their property, they will not be able to get another home in the neighborhood because of price are too high in this district. These people have a very negative representation of the towers because of their impacts on their living environment. But on the other side, the younger population wishing to stay living in the neighborhood is in favor of the idea of living in a high-rise building. They confide that in this district, living in a high-rise building is a guarantee of safety in relation to the problem that can be experienced in individual houses, like we see lack of sunlight, very high promiscuity. These residents also are in favor of more towers in the neighborhood. They think it which could make real estate in this area more accessible than single-family houses. So this interview revealed that the landscape produced can be the object of exclusion and deprivation, or a source of pride and appreciation for the resident. This is why the continuation of my work consists of questioning the perception of the inhabitants at different scales of the territory, taking into account the ordinary landscape by asking daily landscape experiences and the extraordinary landscape. It's why our research combine qualitative and quantitative analysis, which allow us to articulate the study of two scales of the landscape. These two analyses consist to study ordinary landscape. We used commented city walks, and to study the perception of extraordinary landscape, we use photo questionnaires. I want to conclude on this slide. These are the words associated with the towers, the people in the different surveys. This shows us the different perception and give us an idea of the complexity of producing a shared verticalized urban landscape. So the question now, when we see the different representation, is what constitutes the commons? And did the verticalization of these neighborhoods make it possible to produce a landscape as a common, or we are going to fragmentation of the landscape? A landscape that is a source of conflict where each resident has his own representation and his own appreciation. These are the questions interest us for the rest of our work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Asma. We thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move to Professor Julio Pedrasoli. Julio, please.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody.
We are not, no audio. We are not listening to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay, sorry. So I think my screen
But I mean,
is already
yeah,
appearing
we
for
listen
you.
to you, but the sound is very low.
This way is good?
Yeah, that way is
Okay.
good.
Okay,
Thanks.
I will keep my
Thanks.
microphone close to my mouth like this, and so don't be afraid if I make some weird moves during my speech. Okay, so
Okay.
supposedly everybody in the YouTube is already seeing my screen, I guess. So I'm just going to start. First of all, I want to thank you to Manuel and both Manuels, Manuel from São Paulo, Manuel from French, from Lyon, and actually all the researchers involved in the Highrise project that I took part in some of the process during this long trajectory of the project that has been developed in the last 2 years, I guess. And it's a real pleasure to be here and discuss and show something related to the results, to the outcomes of the project. So I'm gonna talk to you about something that I actually work a lot, that is remote sensing. This is my field of research. I'm a professor of remote sensing actually, but I will focus on using the remote sensing to analyze the urban morphology, more precisely the high-rise urban morphology, and try to associate to a different thing that it's not something that we can exactly extract from the satellite image that is the processes. We can see in the satellite images the materials, how the things change over time in terms of material change, not actually the process, but we can try to relate both things to understand. So to start, I would like to start with two questions. Okay, the first one, if it's possible to relate the records of change, as I said, the changes in the materials of the surface in terms of land use, land cover. When, if you think about image classification, that's something that most of you already know it. And if you can relate these changes to a much more complex thing that are the processes, that drive these changes and the physical structure itself. And if you can at least see it from space, I'm talking here to of use satellite image like Landsat. So I'm looking from about 700 kilometers from space to the ground, considering the average sea surface level. And if this change can be seen from the space, can we estimate the patterns of at least two kind of urban occupations that are very common in Brazil and even more common in São Paulo area, São Paulo metro area, that are the formal and informal areas. And about informal areas, I'm talking about slums. I'm not gonna going deep in the slums here. We'll have another chances during the symposium to discuss it, but I will focus more on the formal area and in a specific type of formal area that is the verticalized one, the vertical urbanism. That it's the right term that I just learned from my colleagues here. So, but before I try to reach some kind of answer to the questions that I just asked to myself, if it's possible to relate the physical records of change to process, and if you can do it, can we extract some kind of pattern? Before to do it, before I do it, we need to make some steps back and start to think how it's hard to measure or map or at least see the distribution, spatial distribution of verticalization in a city. Even in São Paulo is a huge, huge city. It's about, I think, 12 million people living there. And if you consider the metro area, it's much more. It's greater. There's some countries like Portugal. There's more people in São Paulo metro area than the entire Portugal area. And one good example is the work from Professor Nadia Somek that will be talking to you, I think, in the last session. Manuel can talk more about it. What she did, and it's very interesting, is to calculate or try to see how the verticalization occurred in São Paulo city, looking to the elevator installation permits. So here from 40s to 2011, how much of the elevators permit are received by the developers to put apartments, but to put elevators in the buildings, not just new buildings, but installation of new buildings is what we call proxy. I'm talking about it because everything that I'm going to show you, it's about proxy. I'm using different kind of data, and with this different kind of data, trying to approach the problem not directly, but trying to infer the verticalization from different sources. So before to go into remote sensing, what I want to show you is something that can relate my work to the premises or a part of the problems involved in the Highrise project, especially in the Brazilian part of the Highrise project, that we have much more data to specialize, like my colleague said, it's different approaches, much more about the trajectories in the French side, but in Brazil we were able to make some spatial analysis and different stuff. So to approach the problem and try to associate what I'm trying to see in the image, I will talk about to you about two things, actually three things. The first one is the vertical urbanism growth rate, or how fast some parts of the city are becoming vertical. And I will try to associate it to a different thing. It's how much the purchasing power increased in other areas of the city. And if the both things occur together, and at the same time, it is spatially related or occurs also in the same spots, the presence of real estate releases, so I can filter it in the space, trying to simulate with some very simple mathematical models, like this one is a mathematical model, this one is another one, and when you put all together, we can see where the things occur at the same time in a certain direction, a certain vector, right? In this case, I want to see where the city is verticalizing and faster, where the city is getting richer and how fast, and if it's associated to vertical expansion in the case of real estate releases. That the data that come from the Highrise project database like Emporis and the EmbraESP database. So just to understand what I mean by vertical urbanism growth rate is considering the available data, 20 years from the census tracts, 91 to 2010, it's how fast, comparing the most recent period to the most the last period, how fast inside the census tracts, about 250 households inside of each census tract, how fast it verticalizes and looking to a specific type of housing, that it's the apartment type. I'm not looking to the buildings here because we don't have the building information on the census, but we have the type, apartment type information. So the numbers are quite high, but I'm applying a very high filter to consider the high rises. So how fast inside a census tract the verticalization grow. So it's a measure of speed, not actually speed, but acceleration, how fast it's growing. So when you do it for São Paulo metro area, applying this this mathematical model, we can see here, actually in the yellowish areas and the green areas here is where the verticalization in 20 years accelerated very fast. So like 5 times faster than the rest of the city, or even 500 times, or even 5,000 times, or bigger in certain points than the rest of the city. It's a very, very, very fast pace of verticalization. This is something. And pay attention to this highlighted red squares now. I'm going to talk about it in a few slides, but it's some areas that are during this process, preparing this presentation, I just asked to Manuel, could you tell me some of the areas that if I make such kind of calculation, do you expect to the phenomenon to happen inside these areas? And he said, okay, I can give you some examples. He gave me 3 examples, and I will show you the relation that I found in these 3 areas. So the second thing is what I called, not I called, but I adapted from the Big Mac Index, what I'm calling purchasing power parity growth rate. Okay, at a long period of time, in Brazil, we have in this period, for example, 2 different currencies. 91, we had Cruzeiro Real. In 2000, in 2010, we have a new currency called Real. The minimum wage is not comparable. It's changed a lot. And if you take 91, for example, and just in that year, the minimum wage changed 3 times in just 1 year, and practically the triple in the end of the year than in the beginning of the year. But in order to be comparable over time in different spots in the space inside the metro area of São Paulo, I took something that I consider as a benchmark, is the food parcel price, and how many food parcels could you buy in average inside each census blocks in the different periods, and how it evolved from the most evolved in this time series that I'm considering. Or what we can see here is that in some places, especially in these blue areas, this is the result of the calculation. I'm going fast, but this is the result of the calculations. As more blue is the area, more the people that are living there now can buy food parcels compared to the past, people that live in this area. So some point it's quite stable. It's this very whitish area, but the bluish area are the areas where the income actually grow, considering the parity the parity of the purchasing parity. But and this big red boxes here that I talked to you when I started, and I asked to Manuel to give me some examples. Actually, are areas where the high-rise project in Brazil mapped a lot of vertical residential high-rise buildings. This is part of the, the database and the analysis of the project. So we have Vila Anastácia, Tatuapé, Vila Andrade, and well-known areas of gentrification that we expect to be gentrified areas. Okay. So what is interesting is that when you combine the both things, and of course, a third thing that it's the real estate release, some of the census tracts stand out. This is what I'm expect to see in the map if I use the combined model, if I combine the two mathematical models that I brought to you before, areas where the verticalization growth rate is very high, and at the same time, the purchasing power parity is also very high. And if in the same areas occurred the phenomenon of real estate releases being launched there, I can consider this potential study area. So this is a very high filter that apply. It means that the verticalization growth has to be at least 5 times higher than the rest of the city. And the purchasing power parity have to be 25% greater than the other parts of the city. And at the same time, the real estate release have to exist at least one in the same period of time. And what we get, it's about 251 census tracts out of approximately 30,000 in São Paulo. So it's quite concentrated when apply this combination of things together. And interestingly, this combination is quite concentrated not only in these red boxes, but it kind of converges to the analysis of the high-rise living project in São Paulo. So we have a convergence here and here and here of high level and high speed of verticalization, a high concentration of income, and the occurrence of vertical real estate release. This is quite interesting. But this is just half of the story. Not exactly half of the story, but half of my story, okay, that I'm trying to show you. Actually, what I showed you until here, it's working with tabular data and data that the agencies like Brazilian Institutes of Geographics and Statistics collected in the field, asking people, and there's a huge time series, and you can use it and you can derive this kind of, you can use this kind of modeling to derive the differences. But what I'm trying to say is that if you don't have this kind of information, how can we approach this kind of processes using not the process itself, but the changes in the Earth's surfaces that we can, for example, detect looking to a satellite image? There are many different ways to classify an image, including a satellite image, since some algorithms come from the 60s and 70s. There are the classical ones. There are some much modern approaches like deep machine learning, like support vector machine or random forest, or even more sophisticated ways to do it, like deep learning. Deep learning is not actually considering the pixel itself, but it's considering the context. Different. It's not like the support vector machine or the random forest that are just looking to the pixel, but all these classifiers, beside of its if they are more or less complex than each other, they are kind of binary. In the end, what you have is if a pixel belongs to a certain class, this class will be assigned to that pixel. But we can look to this process in a different way. And maybe, or maybe not, many of you are familiar with mathematics or physics, but to understand what I'm trying to explain here is that that you can look at the pixel and think in something similar when you hear a music. So it's you can actually think about Fourier series. When you hear a music, it's the combination of different instruments together, then they are fused linearly in most of the case. And what you hear in the end is the linear combination of that different waves in a unique wave. There is the sum of all the different waves. But you can actually make the reverse engineering of it, and to separate the different waves that compose that unique wave that is the music. Like you can separate the guitar, the piano, the voice, and so on. You can actually do the same with a pixel. If you look at a pixel it's just a number, and I'm talking about here a Landsat pixel is 30 by 30, about 900 square kilometers. But you can actually separate, if you tell to the computer what are the things that you think that are inside and contributed to that to form that number, and how much they contribute. It's exactly the same thing if as you could separate the instruments of a music. This is something that we call spectral mixture, and we can unmix this spectral mixture model inside each pixel. So in this example, it's a decomposition of a pixel. How is the percentage of the vegetation, water, and bare soil that contribute to the number registered in this pixel? This is important because this is a dimensionality reduction, and we can reduce a lot of dimensions in simple dimensions to track it on time. In order to do it, like I said, we need to give to the computer something to the algorithm to work on. So if inside a pixel there are a lot of things, and inside a Landsat pixel like this one that I'm working here, 900 square kilometers, there's not just a block, there's not just a house, there's everything inside, and river and water and houses and high rises and everything together mixed. But you can kind of simplify the land surface in three things. At least the land surface, the Earth surface between the tropic, between this habitable area of the Earth, where more than 9% of the people live. So you can think about the Earth surface that can be formed or can be modeled like parts that are very reflective, high albedo, parts that are very low reflective, low albedo, like water and shadows. The energy comes in, but the energy don't comes out, like a shadow. There is no return of the energy. And vegetation. Vegetation is this other thing that can separate. So this is what we call global end members. And this is work developed by Professor Chris Small from University of Columbia. And he developed three global end members that we can actually apply to every city and the world. We can separate what we call substrate from vegetation from dark surface. Substrate can be bare soil or constructed areas. Vegetation is vegetation, and dark surfaces are low albedo, like shadows and water. So we can very easily estimate how is the percentage of contribution of all of these three things in each pixel. Each pixel have his own history now. So in the beginning, I show you something that I was working on, the census data and the real estate points that I showed you. I'm including a new layer here that is the orbital remote sensing. I'm using some samples of Landsat images, and the choose of the data I can explain it later if someone has questions, but it's related to the sun position and in order to guarantee calibration between the different times. So decomposing all the pixels for that different years in the São Paulo metro area and correlating these values of, look at this black line, of shadows that I can extract from the pixels with the apartment types that I can extract from the census tracts. As you can see, this is just a simple person's correlation. Most of the correlation is positive. So greater is the increase of apartment types from census tracts, greater is the increase of shadows in the image. Part of it can be explained because we lost the detection of substrate, that would be the constructed area, but the high rise, if they are very high, the shadows start to cover what you should detect as a different type of land cover. This is so a huge part of this strange correlation can be explained by this. So high rises, they generate shadows, and this is why they are very positively correlated. If you look at your image, if you look at the census information, they are very correlated. And for example, this is an area in Metro São Paulo area, Metro São Paulo, Maria Zélia neighborhood from construction site, 2002, 2005, 2010, 2015. This is what we can call trajectory of the pixels. In this case, few pixels here in this area. If you look to the substrate in the beginning, it's kind of a little bit of substrate, a little bit of shadow, and a lot of vegetation in this area. This is before this image, actually. I'm looking 85 here. You can see that the substrate at some point goes up because the vegetation was cut off to start the construction. And then at some point, the substrate start to decline, but the shadows start to increase. So, and of course, the vegetation never comes back and probably will never come back. But what we can see here is a kind of trajectory, but we can consider it as a spectral temporal signature of a verticalization process, looking to a time series in a satellite image. This is derived from a time series that I calculated using the n members, how much the substrate change over time, how much the shadows change over the time, and how much the vegetation change over the time. This is why in the beginning I start talking about, okay, the slums have their own signature too, because they have actually. I'm just not showing here today. But you can also try to relate it to how the land prices change. This is the distribution of the price increases or decrease, depends on how you look at it, but all the prices increased actually from 85 to 2015 of the real estate release that the Highrise project used in his research, in their research here in São Paulo metro area. So you can see there's a lot of concentration of price increases, but it's being spread out in different axes outside of the city of São Paulo. You can see the vectors of expansion just looking to the prices. If you look to this distribution of prices, I'm taking an example here. That's the city of Taboão da Serra, a very small one, very close to the Morumbi area, very fancy area in São Paulo, historically fancy area in São Paulo, and with a different scale. But again, even if the scale is not so great as in the São Paulo city, the image can actually capture some changes here. So if we look at this last figure here, it's how the shadows increase in the same period. So the price is increased, and this is a process. But when you look to the material change, they also increase. Different scale, of course. I'm talking here about a very large pixel, and there's some shifting here, but you can see that it's concentrated here in this part of the city, here in this part of the city, just looking to the shadow. So supposedly we can, if you know very well the relation between these two processes, we can just look to the images and argue that it's the prices are increasing related to the, at least in this case, because I know I have the ground truth to show it. Okay, so shadows increase related to the prices increase, materials, processes. Okay, look into the same image that I generate in the beginning. You can see here in Taboão da Serra, there are also some census tracts that respond to that mathematical modeling that I just created for this presentation. It's not something that I'm really working on, but it occurs here and here. In Taboão da Serra, you also have a high rate of verticalization associated to a high rate of income increasing, of people moving or living there in at least 2 points, very close to the areas where the prices increased and the shadows increased. So if I look at everything together, all together, we can see that there are a price increase. The image will show a very similar process, and I'm looking to the shadows because I'm trying to associate it to the verticalization. This is how I model it. And we have a lot of vertical real estate release, investors putting the buildings in this area, and at least 2 very expensive are related to the spot. So just to finish, it was quite fast actually. What I'm trying to bring to the discussion, I know the discussion will go on during the weeks and other people will present their work and we have a lot to discuss about it, but what I can bring to the discussion is how to model this process that I'm trying to approach what I'm calling gentrification. It's not easy because I'm not even considering that some of the process is due to the state intervention, or to the state is giving the opportunity to this to happen, or even forcing this to happen. I'm not putting this in the model, but I'm just looking to the results of it. But how to model and how to detect it? It's possible, yes. It depends on how you understand the model and if the model makes sense. So, for example, here I'm just bringing you a very simple model that vertical urbanism increase plus the money concentration gap increase. It's multiplied, it's expanded by the real estate market over time. This is what my mathematical models are showing now. And is it related to gentrification? And probably some of you will discuss it later. But one thing from the remote sensing point of view, that it's from people who are from this specific area, it's very important to discuss from this kind of analysis. That is the relation between the physical characteristics that this is actually the things that we can actually extract and calculate from an image is just how the material that compose that pixel behaves in relation to the sun. The light comes in, part is absorbed, part is reflected, part is transmitted, and that's it. But this behavior changes over the time. It is possible to use this behavioral physical change over the time to characterize processes. Well, it depends. For the São Paulo case, for example, I'm quite sure it's possible to relate in a lot of areas that the shadows increase due to the specific physical changes in the territory, that is the morphology associated to the vertical urbanism. It's depicting a much more complex process in the territory, in the city. So there's room for make this kind of relation depending on how you understand your area and what the tools that you have to model it. So for now, that's it, and I appreciate your attention, and thank you for hearing a little bit of my work.
Thanks a lot, Julio. Let me just check. Oh, wait. If we have questions maybe everybody could come back to the screen if possible. Then we can start debating a little bit. We still have about 22 minutes if you want. Asma should be here also. Anyway, Manuel, unfortunately, he had to leave. He was called for a late appointment after we had scheduled this presentation, but well, I don't know if Asma is still on with us. Evandro, you know, can you share Asma screen? Is it possible, please? Oh, she disconnected. Maybe she had problems again. Anyway, so here we are. I will just start. I mean, thank you very much, guys. And also, although Asma and Manuel are not here for such enriching talks and contributions to our discussion, something that crossed most of the work. I mean, basically the first two. I mean, it's related. Of course, there are singularities, but related to the spatial capital or the social construction and performance of views or landscape. It's also more specifically dealt in Melbourne and in Pinheiros. Not that these are the only questions, but they are common questions, and also in Ora. What Julio brings to us is a possibility that could be, and that has been one of the goals of the project, to develop a set of procedures that in some cases can be replicated and used to study other areas of verticalization in other cities, not only São Paulo. So I will start with the question that Manuel left Maíra and Milena, even though Maíra made some comments in the chat, but Manuel was the others that are watching in the YouTube don't have access to that, and he made a comment, he made an observation about the negotiation of the spaces of supposed so-called public space in the street level, and considering the recommendations that you bring to the municipality, even if they are preliminary. He asked how the space you criticize in terms of the design terms that they bring demonstrate uses, other uses, not only that separate people, that separate people instead of mixing them. Can you talk a little bit more about it, please?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we have some singularities about our case. I would like to separate the question in two parts. First of all, is that the temporary public spaces. Manuel, just can you close your microphone, please?
It's closed.
Here on the bottom. Yeah, thank you. It's because I was hearing some echo. To separate these two things, is that the temporary spaces like parklets, they are not part of the Daitx propositions. They are a public policy from the city of São Paulo, and their policy, I believe that it started in 2014. I think that Milena can correct me if I'm wrong, along with the new general urban plan. So they have almost the same age, but they are not part of the incentive that the Daitx areas have. In these cases, this is an area of the master's degree investigation of Milena. The parklets are public spaces. They cannot be used for private interests, but sometimes they are privately produced. So an individual can buy a parklet, install it in front of his house or his store, and use it as a public space. It should not be used privately. But what we could see in the practice is that the majority of the parklets from São Paulo were being used only for consumption. So a lot of bars and restaurants installed parklets in front of their stores, in order to use that as a reception area and so on. But they are legally and should be used as public spaces. While we were doing our field research, we saw that during the period that the restaurants and the bars are not open, there are other types of practices going on in these spaces. So people who are passing by the streets that sit to smoke or to wait for someone. Some people that are riding a bike and want to rest for a while. But during the hours that the bar and restaurants are open, the people who occupy these spaces are normally consumers from the bars and restaurants that are in front of these parklets. We made some considerations about the Daitx law that regarding the relationship between the public spaces and these new high rises, especially the ones regarding the fruition areas and the active facades. We saw that in our zoning law and also in our general plan, the qualification for an active facade is not really developed. So they only consider non-residential uses. While when we discuss a lot about the use of active facades to increase urbanity in public spaces, in the streets, we know that they are related to specific uses. So this can cause a problem if the new ground floors from these new buildings start to be used not for commercial areas or for high elitized commercial services, where the people that are passing by the street won't have a direct connection between these ground floors and the public spaces. So they will continue being excluded from what these new buildings could provide to the city. But we have a problem is that in our area, only 3 buildings are completely released, so they are constructed, and the other 16 new high-rises, they are still under construction. So the analysis we did was based on perspectives from the project. So they are much more critical analysis about the new release, the new high-rise releases, but we still weren't able to analyze it live in practice as a field research. So the examples of limitations that we brought to you during this presentation, when I have formal and informal commerce, we have limits where people cannot appropriate the private areas from the buildings, the high-rises. They are all related to the old high-rises buildings, but there is something that is already present in the area. So if the city wants to create a new environment for the city in these axis, they can take that old examples into consideration and create some alterations or discuss more about these points when these new buildings are being released or they are asking for permission to be constructed. But there is some point that we cannot deny in any way, is that we don't have public housing and we don't have social mix. We may have different kinds of public appropriation, but in terms of housing, the area is really homogeneous, okay? So they are, for the elites, it's one of the most expensive areas from the city of São Paulo. And these won't change in the next years with the prices that we are having now. So if the municipality wants to create social housing and popular market housing in central areas, but the central areas that are already valued by the market, they need to start to look better at these points from the general urban plan and the zoning law. I know that they are already discussing some alterations to give more incentives for construction companies that create popular market units and that also create social housing. But we don't have the effects of that, especially now, because all of these discussions are because of the pandemic. This year of 2021, the general urban plan will be reviewed. Well, it was supposed to be reviewed. So we have a lot of discussions going on about that. So that's why we created some considerations about the politics of the axis in our conclusions. Manuel, you are mute.
Yes, thanks. I was been mute until evening. Now I was saying if Christian has any question, otherwise I have another one to Julio. I don't know. Okay. Julio, a question. Based on your tests in your experiments, how much can you, in the work you have been developing, how much you think that we can effectively build a relation between Highrise or the algorithm that you've been developing? Because when we start talking about it, it was kind of identifying possible areas of verticalization. The goal, our goal was much more humble. So even we talked about doing it for other cities in a kind of atlas and so on. And then now what we see is that there is a correlation, at least, or a strong possibility to use this technique to identify not only verticalization areas or vertical areas, but tendencies of these areas when we cross-reference the information with other social and economic info, whatever they come from. So what do you expect? Because it seems to me it's a very strong and powerful possibility to read urban territories or the transformation of the urban morphology. I would like to know a little bit more what our expectations are about it.
Okay, well, as you know, I am finishing to develop a kind of a software to make it easier to extract. But what I can say is that this approach that I use, that I showed you today, it will work very well in cities like São Paulo. There are very, the high rises are very tall. There are a lot of high rises. So the physical thing that is happening, there's no way to not detect it. So when you have a lot of high rises going up, shadows will appear and will detect in this time series if you know how to use this data. This probably work for São Paulo, probably work for Rio de Janeiro, probably will work for Salvador and different cities in Brazil, because the Brazilian cities are like this. I tried to do it, if you remember, not try to do it, but I tested it in Lyon, for example. But Lyon, there are 5, 6, I don't remember how many high-rise tabunis. It's not that, and it's a very old city, and I'm just talking about 30 years at maximum. I think Lyon is more than 2,000 years. It's not exactly the tool that you can use there. But I think in the global south, there's a lot of good examples that you could try to use this kind of technique to detect at least the verticalization in a different scale, not in the scale of the building, as I showed you. It's in a different scale and aggregating into the municipality or a larger areas of the city. But it's probably useful in these global south countries, especially because Brazil is an exception. We have a lot of information, a lot of data from Brazilian Institute, the IBGE, Brazilian Institute of Geographics and Statistics. Is not really common. It's not really common even in French, as I can remember, that it's not easy to get the information about the census in Lyon. I was thinking about it yesterday, the things that we're thinking at the beginning. Okay, let's do the same thing to Lyon, but it's not actually possible because you don't have the census tract in the same scale. It's LSOA, different things, and this is and this is an important point that divides the two approaches and the research also. So it's possible, but I can tell you that even the shadows will not help in some places like Lyon and other cities. There are other approaches that actually can do it, can map the verticalization process, even over time. Like I said, there are new ways to classify image like deep learning. And deep learning, it seems like something weird, confused, but actually that's not. It's just a different way to approach in terms of image classification. Deep learning can be used to different things in the world, but for image classification, when you talk about deep learning, you talk about context. For the computer, it's much easier to differentiate something that is said to the computer. This is the verticalized area, a vertical area, and it seems a kind of a magic. Is not it, but it can recognize it. We did some very. I'm working actually in a project called Map Biomas here in Brazil, and maybe some of you heard about it. I don't know, but it's mapped all the biomes in Brazilian, and what I call transversal team. It's one of the teams that it traverse all the biomes is the urban areas, and this is something that a lot of people are waiting for. If we can map the verticalized area, the vertical areas, the low high and low areas, and so on, because there are a lot of demand on it for example, in not for this kind of analysis that you're doing, but for urban climate analysis. Maybe you heard about uh, uh, LCZs, local climate zones, that it's based in the urban morphology. One of the morphology, on the most important morphology to the wind circulation inside the city and the heat and so on, is how high are the buildings, how close to each other they are. So there is a lot of different things that we can use this approach to map it. But we cannot use the shadows to map a city like Lyon, but probably we can use deep learning to map the verticalization in Lyon, and I can assure you it's possible. So it's inside remote sensing, map verticalization is not something that it's being extensively explored yet. So there's a lot of room for testing here.
Okay. Christian, any question?
No, I do not really have questions. Well, first because we do not have a lot of time left, but it's more some sort of reflection on methodology, because what we just have seen by Julio and others is the use of very different methodologies for the same object, and also the question is what kind of methodology can be used here and there. Is it possible to have some sort of global methodology, and how are we going to adapt it to other? Because here Julio was saying, well, it is very useful in the global south, but perhaps less so, at least for the moment, in Europe. So the idea is, well, to know to what extent one method might be used in all kinds of situation, all kinds of cities. The method used by Maíra, Milena, Asma, and Louise can be used. You say you go to see people and you ask them questions, but well, the same question in different contexts might not yield the same answers, because the minds of people are not made the same way, whether the imaginaries are not the same, and so on and so on. So that's more the reflection I had on what we heard. It's really it goes from far above the earth to the inside of the house and so on. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's one of the objectives that we had, and then also something that you pointed out this morning, maybe a little bit ambitious, but anyway. And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves. What can be learned, and what can be not replicated, but can be adjusted to one's different methodologies or different technique, just like Julio presented to us. What adjustments that it will demand in order to be applied to other cities, if possible. And also the other ones, I mean, more, let's say, not classical, but other ways to look at the same issue, not the same question, but with different approaches. Not necessarily with a different methodology, because based on field work and some classical field work, but again, presenting different results and different ways and strategies to look at the matter of vertical urbanism and verticalization. Not only relate to the singularities of each city, but also to some other particulars.
There is a comment on not of the private chat, but on the other, from Milena. She says, no, it's almost impossible in Brazil too, because the government isn't investing in collecting this data anymore. This is also a big question, because, well, on the one side you have the data which is available and which is available through time, because all the work that Julio is doing is based on the fact that data will come, because if not, it will become history very soon. If you have a gap in data, well, you can go a little bit over it, but it's something which is really a big problem. Big data, but also big problems surrounding if you have a government which doesn't want or just changes policy. But in France, for a long time, we had difficulties to access a lot of data, even public ones. Now they are changing, because everybody is thinking and talking about open data or free, or how can you do that? So it's also another problem when you use quantitative data, and when you use qualitative data, it's also a problem, because well, you have to access people, and people have to allow you to come and to ask questions. And also in universities, a lot of universities have a lot of protocols about ethics, which makes it quite difficult just to ask questions to people or to specific part of the population. So for social scientists, it's also a problem. For small data, big data.
We have very strong ethical procedures here also. I mean, and what Jean points out, I mean, I really don't know what's going to happen, because if the government, if he maintains what he's proposing, that's a significant change in the way the census is collected and everything. I mean, it's in fact what it is. It's a way of almost making impossible the design of any public policy, because we will not have the data about it. But I don't know. Let's see what happens. Well,
just one word to finish, Manuel. Can I take
sure.
it? No, this
Go
is
ahead.
Considering your speech and the Christian speech. It's for me, this is something that makes me see with much more importance this kind of work, trying to calibrate the image in the areas that you actually have the data to calibrate it, because probably we will not have in the future the census data to do it again, at least in the next 10 years, probably, or in the countries that you don't have. This is why the remote sensing, I know it's something that sometimes they're not considering very useful, but if you can calibrate in the areas that you have the data itself, you don't have you can apply it in different scenarios, and you can fill the gap, the data gap that Christian is pointing out. This is why there are a lot of people working in urban remote sensing now also.
Okay, let's try to, or let's be as much as we can strict to our schedule. It's now 3:32 here in Brazil, 8:32 in Lyon.
You see artificial light.
I want to thank you all. Thank you very much for your participation and contribution, and see you guys tomorrow.
To see you tomorrow, morning, afternoon. Bye, and thank you. It was really very interesting. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.